Most people react. Something happens, unexpected, unfair, stressful, and their emotions jump in first. The voice rises, the face tightens, the mind rushes to conclusions. But then there are others. You've seen them. When tension fills the room, they stay quiet. When others argue, they pause. When chaos breaks out, they don't rush to defend themselves. At first glance, they can seem detached, cold, even indifferent. But psychology tells a very different story. Because people who rarely react emotionally are not emotionally empty. They're emotionally strategic. And that difference gives them an advantage most people never realize exists. Here's the uncomfortable truth. In high-pressure moments, emotional reactions feel natural, but they're often the least effective response. Reacting feels like strength. Control feels passive. But in reality, restraint requires far more psychological power than reaction ever will. Studies in behavioral psychology show that when emotions spike, cognitive capacity drops, decision-making narrows, memory distorts, impulse takes over. That's why arguments escalate, why small problems explode, why people say things they regret and later swear that wasn't really me. But the people who don't react emotionally have learned something early, often without realizing it. Not every emotion deserves immediate expression. They understand that emotions are information, not commands. Instead of reacting, they observe. Instead of defending, they wait. Instead of exploding, they analyze. And in so doing, they quietly gain leverage over the situation. This doesn't mean they don't feel anger or fear or frustration. It means they've learned how to delay expression until clarity returns. That delay, sometimes only a few seconds, changes everything. Because while others are reacting, they're already thinking ahead. And thinking ahead is where their advantage begins. Psychologists talk about something called the response gap. It's the space between what happens and how you respond. For most people, that space barely exists. Stimulus to reaction, trigger to emotion to behavior. But people who rarely react emotionally have trained that gap to widen. Inside that pause, something powerful happens. They ask themselves, often unconsciously, what's really happening here? What's the best response, not the loudest one? What matters 5 minutes from now? That pause protects them from emotional hijacking. Because strong emotions are fast, reason is slower. If emotion always goes first, logic never gets a chance. These individuals don't suppress emotions. That would backfire. Instead, they delay them. And delay is control. This is why they often appear calm during confrontations, why they don't rush to explain themselves, why silence is their default, not weakness. Silence buys time. Time restores clarity. In group dynamics, this has an unexpected effect. When someone stays calm while others react, attention shifts toward them. Their words carry more weight because they speak less but with intention. Psychology calls this emotional authority. People instinctively trust those who don't seem driven by impulse. That's why leaders, negotiators, surgeons, and crisis managers often share this trait. Not because they're fearless, but because they've learned to pause. And once you can pause, you can choose. Most people never develop this skill because reacting feels like relief, expression feels honest, holding back feels uncomfortable. But comfort isn't the same as effectiveness, and effectiveness is where emotionally restrained people quietly dominate.
One of the biggest emotional triggers is personalization. Someone criticizes you, disrespects you, ignores you. Most people instantly translate that into, "This is about me." But people who rarely react emotionally interpret situations differently. They don't automatically internalize external behavior. Instead of asking, "Why are they doing this to me?" they ask, "What's going on with them?" That shift changes everything, because when you stop personalizing, emotional intensity drops. Psychologists call this decentering, the ability to step outside your own perspective and see events objectively. This doesn't mean they lack self-respect. It means they don't tie their self-worth to every interaction. They understand something many people never learn. Other people's behavior usually reflects their internal state, not your value. That realization acts like emotional armor. Insults lose their sting. Provocation loses its power. Drama feels unnecessary. This is why emotionally restrained people often walk away from arguments without feeling defeated. They weren't trying to win, they were protecting their mental bandwidth. And that bandwidth gets redirected into thinking, planning, and long-term outcomes. While others burn energy reacting, they conserve it. And conservation leads to endurance. This trait rarely develops in comfort. People who don't react emotionally often learn the hard way that reacting made things worse. They've lived through moments where losing control had consequences. Emotional reactions were used against them. Staying calm was the only safe option. Over time, the brain adapts. Neuroscience shows that repeated exposure to high-stress situations reshapes emotional regulation pathways. In simple terms, their nervous system learned restraint. Not because they wanted to be calm, but because calm worked. This is why emotionally restrained people often have a quiet intensity about them. They've seen what happens when emotions take over, and they've decided it's not worth the cost. That experience creates internal confidence. They trust themselves under pressure. They don't panic because panic has never helped them before. This makes them resilient in ways that don't show on the surface. They don't need to prove anything. They've already survived enough to know who they are. Here's something subtle. People who rarely react emotionally are often misunderstood. Some see them as distant. Others think they're unemotional. A few mistake silence for weakness. But over time, perception shifts. Because when decisions matter, when tension rises, when things go wrong, these are the people others turn to. Not consciously, instinctively. Because calm signals competence. The human brain associates emotional control with reliability. That's why in stressful moments, the calmest person often becomes the informal leader, even without authority. Their presence stabilizes the group, and stability is magnetic. They don't demand attention. Attention moves toward them. This quiet influence is one of their greatest advantages, and they rarely exploit it. They don't need to.
Here's the final truth. People who rarely react emotionally live longer inside their own mind. They don't exhaust themselves with constant emotional spikes. They don't replay arguments endlessly. They don't stay trapped in reaction loops. This gives them clarity, and clarity compounds. Over time, they make better decisions. They protect their energy. They avoid unnecessary conflict. Not because they're passive, but because they're selective. They understand that not every battle deserves emotion. Not every comment deserves response. Not every moment deserves reaction. And that restraint becomes power. So if you've ever been told you're too calm, you don't react enough, you're hard to read, psychology suggests something else entirely. You may have developed a rare psychological advantage, one that doesn't shout, doesn't demand attention, but quietly shapes outcomes in your favor. Because in a world addicted to reaction, control is revolutionary.